This narrative reconstruction examines the intense congressional inquiry involving Representative Frank Mrvan and FBI Director Kash Patel, focusing on the high-stakes interrogation regarding a profound breach of data security protocols. The setting is one of palpable tension, where the weight of national security interests clashes with the rigorous demands of legislative oversight within the halls of the United States Capitol. Mrvan begins his line of questioning with a surgical precision designed to peel back the layers of bureaucratic obfuscation surrounding a specific Department of Justice communication. This email, central to the controversy, allegedly contained directives for field agents to bypass standard encrypted protocols in favor of unsecured channels for transmitting active operational intelligence. The implications of such a directive are staggering, suggesting a systemic disregard for the very safeguards intended to protect undercover assets and ongoing investigations from foreign interference. As the hearing progresses, the dialogue shifts from introductory formalities to a direct confrontation over the authenticity and execution of internal departmental policies. Director Patel, sitting before the committee, initially maintains a posture of composed denial, asserting that the Bureau's commitment to data integrity remains beyond reproach. However, the representative produces documentation that challenges this narrative, forcing a shift in the director's testimony that ripples through the hearing room. The atmosphere thickens as the representative meticulously connects the timeline of the emails dispatched to a series of vulnerabilities identified by independent cybersecurity auditors. This phase of the inquiry serves to establish a foundation for the subsequent exposure of internal contradictions within the FBI's leadership. The core of the dispute rests on the director's initial claim that no such order to use unsecure channels ever originated from his office or the Department of Justice at large. Mrvan's systematic approach involves cross-referencing previous statements made under oath with the digital paper trail now laid bare before the public record. This process is not merely a political exercise but a fundamental test of the transparency required of those entrusted with the nation's most sensitive secrets. By highlighting the discrepancy between the director's public assurances and the private directives sent to agents in the field, the hearing exposes a rift in the chain of command. This rift suggests either a failure of internal communication or a deliberate attempt to prioritize operational speed over the security of the information being handled. As the director is pressed further on the specifics of the compromised data, his responses begin to reveal a troubling lack of situational awareness regarding the current status of the breached information. The admission that the director does not know the physical location or the security status of the exfiltrated data marks a turning point in the proceedings. This acknowledgement undercuts the earlier assertions of total departmental control and raises urgent questions about the potential for long-term damage to national security. The loss of sensitive operational data via unsecured channels is not a technicality. It is a vulnerability that can be exploited by adversaries to compromise the safety of personnel. The director's inability to provide a clear accounting of the breach highlights a significant lapse in the accountability expected of a high-ranking intelligence official. The unfolding drama serves as a stark critique of institutional transparency, particularly when the mechanisms of law enforcement and intelligence gathering intersect with political accountability. It portrays a scenario where the guardians of the law are themselves subject to the scrutiny of the law, revealing the complexities of governing a modern security state. The hearing is presented as a fictionalized lens through which the public can view the inherent friction between the need for secrecy and the necessity of democratic oversight. By the end of this opening segment, the stage is set for a deeper exploration of whether these failures were the result of administrative incompetence or a calculated strategy to mislead. The narrative remains focused on the structural integrity of these institutions and the individuals who lead them through times of crisis. The questioning continues with an investigation into the specific technical nature of the unsecured channels mentioned in the DOJ email. Mrvan demands a clarification on why standard operating procedures were ignored, especially given the high sensitivity nature of the operations involved. The director's silence in the face of these technical inquiries suggests a disconnect between the executive leadership and the technical reality of field operations. This disconnect is portrayed as a systemic failure, where the top-down directives are issued without a full understanding of the digital risks involved in modern espionage. The representative's persistence in seeking a definitive answer reflects a broader concern about the erosion of trust between the legislative branch and the intelligence community. Each response from the director is analyzed for its consistency with established legal frameworks governing the handling of classified material. The dialogue moves into the realm of legal liability, questioning whether the issuance of such a directive constitutes a violation of federal record-keeping laws. If the director was aware of the directive, he faces accusations of negligence. If he was not, he faces accusations of losing control over his own agency. This binary choice presents a grim outlook for the reputation of the Bureau, as both options suggest a profound failure of leadership. The narrative emphasizes that in the world of high-level intelligence, there is no room for ambiguity when it comes to the security of data. The hearing then shifts focus to the potential motives behind the use of unsecured channels, exploring whether this was a matter of convenience or something more clandestine. Mrvan posits that the use of such channels might have been an attempt to avoid the very oversight he is currently exercising. Information sent through non-standard means is often more difficult to track, archive, and retrieve for congressional review, creating a shadow communication network. The director's defense hinges on the necessity of rapid communication in fast-moving tactical environments, yet this defense falters when weighed against the known risks of interception. The tension in the room is exacerbated by the realization that the security of the American public may have been gambled for the sake of administrative expediency. As the details of the email are read into the record, the language used by the DOJ officials is scrutinized for its authoritative tone and lack of caveats. It was not a suggestion but an instruction, leaving field agents with little choice but to comply with a direct order that compromised their own security. This aspect of the testimony highlights the ethical dilemma faced by subordinates who are forced to choose between following orders and maintaining professional standards of data protection. The representative uses this to paint a picture of a department where the culture of compliance has superseded the culture of security. The director's eventual admission of ignorance regarding the data's current status serves as the final blow to the narrative of a secure and well-managed agency. Ultimately, this segment of the transcript captures a moment of institutional reckoning, where the flaws in the system are laid bare for all to see. The critique is not just directed at one individual, but at the entire structure that allowed such a breach to occur and remain unaddressed. The narrative maintains a neutral yet rigorous perspective, focusing on the facts of the interrogation and the logical conclusions that can be drawn from the testimony. It serves as a reminder that the price of security is constant vigilance, not just against external threats, but against internal decay and the lack of transparency. The hearing continues to unravel the complexities of power, information, and the heavy responsibility of those who wield both in the name of the law. Building upon the established tension of the hearing, the interrogation moves into a grueling second phase where the logistics of the data breach are scrutinized with relentless focus. Representative Mrvan shifts his line of questioning toward the specific timeline of the Department of Justice email, aiming to pin down exactly when the chain of command was alerted to the vulnerability. The director's posture, while still ostensibly professional, begins to show signs of the immense pressure inherent in defending a systemic failure of this magnitude. Each question is framed not as a political jab, but as a necessary inquiry into the operational integrity of the nation's premier law enforcement agency. The silence that follows particularly pointed questions serves to amplify the gravity of the situation, suggesting that the answers may be more damaging than the lack thereof. As the discussion turns to the technical specifics of the communication, Mrvan highlights the inherent risks of transmitting operational data through unencrypted or non-standard government channels. He argues that by bypassing established security protocols, the agency effectively invited adversarial interception, thereby endangering the lives of those operating in the field. The director's attempts to characterize these actions as isolated incidents or administrative errors are met with documented evidence to the contrary, suggesting a broader pattern of negligence. This segment of the hearing delves deep into the nuances of cybersecurity policy, illustrating how even a minor deviation from protocol can have catastrophic consequences for national security. The focus remains on the structural failures that allowed such a lapse in judgment to be codified in a departmental directive. The dialogue explores the psychological and professional impact on field agents who were essentially ordered to operate in an environment of increased risk. Mrvan posits that such directives undermine the morale of the rank and file, creating a sense of betrayal among those who rely on the leadership for protection and clear guidance. The director is forced to address whether these agents were given any recourse to object to these orders, or if the culture of the Bureau prioritized blind obedience over safety. This line of inquiry paints a vivid picture of a hierarchical structure where the top-down pressure for results often obscures the fundamental necessity of operational security. The hearing thus becomes a broader meditation on the ethics of leadership within high-stakes government institutions. Continuing with the examination of the email's origins, the representative seeks to identify the specific individuals responsible for drafting and approving the directive to use unsecured channels. This effort to assign individual accountability is a key theme of the proceedings, as it challenges the notion of anonymous bureaucratic failure. By demanding names and dates, Mrvan attempts to break through the shield of institutional plausible deniability that often protects high-ranking officials from the consequences of their decisions. The director's reluctance to provide specific names, citing ongoing internal reviews, only serves to heighten the suspicion that the agency is more interested in self-protection than in transparency. The narrative captures the friction between the legislative right to know and the executive's desire to keep its internal processes private. The focus then pivots to the actual nature of the data that was compromised, moving from abstract operational data to the concrete reality of what was lost. Mrvan questions whether the breached information included the identities of confidential human sources or the details of active surveillance operations against foreign intelligence threats. The director's admission that he cannot confirm the status or location of this data creates a chilling effect throughout the hearing room, as the full scale of the potential damage begins to materialize. This lack of certainty from the head of the FBI suggests a level of institutional disarray that is deeply troubling to the committee and the public. The hearing transitions from a debate over policy to an urgent assessment of a live security crisis. The interrogation further examines the disconnect between the director's public testimony and the internal communications that were occurring at the same time the breach was being managed. Mrvan points to a series of internal memos that seem to contradict the director's earlier claims that the situation was under control and that no sensitive assets were at risk. This discrepancy suggests a deliberate attempt to manage the narrative, rather than provide an honest accounting of the failures to the Oversight Committee. The narrative emphasizes the role of the whistleblower or the leaked document in stripping away the layers of official spin to reveal the raw, unvarnished truth of the matter. It portrays the hearing as a battleground for the truth in an era where information is frequently weaponized for political gain. The director is then asked to explain the criteria used to determine which data was deemed safe for transmission via unsecured channels, a question that reveals the arbitrary nature of the department's decision-making process. Mrvan argues that in the realm of counterintelligence, there is no such thing as low-risk data when dealing with sophisticated foreign actors who can piece together fragments of information to form a complete picture. This perspective challenges the Bureau's internal risk assessment models, suggesting they are antiquated and out of touch with the reality of modern cyber warfare. The hearing exposes a fundamental flaw in how the agency balances the need for speed with the absolute requirement for security. The director's defense of these practices appears increasingly fragile as the technical arguments against them mount. As the hearing enters its second hour, the atmospheric tension is heightened by the realization that the breach may not have been an accident, but a calculated shortcut. Mrvan explores the possibility that the use of unsecured channels was a response to a lack of resources or a failure to maintain the necessary secure infrastructure. This shifts the blame from individual decision-makers to a broader failure of the government to adequately fund and prioritize the security of its most sensitive communications. The director is forced to navigate the political minefield of admitting to systemic weaknesses while simultaneously trying to maintain public confidence in the agency's capabilities. The narrative remains steadfast in its neutral observation of these power dynamics, documenting the slow erosion of institutional credibility. The questioning concludes this segment with a focus on the long-term implications of the director's lack of knowledge regarding the compromised data's current status. If the head of the FBI does not know where the data is, Mrvan asks, how can the American people be expected to trust that the agency is fulfilling its primary mission of protection? This question strikes at the very heart of the social contract between the government and its citizens, highlighting the fragility of that trust when transparency is absent. The director's inability to provide a reassuring answer leaves a void that is quickly filled by the implications of the hearing's findings. This part of the transcript serves as a powerful indictment of a leadership style that favors opacity over accountability. The final moments of this portion of the testimony are characterized by a series of rapid-fire questions designed to lock the director into specific statements that can be verified later. Mrvan's strategy is clearly aimed at building a comprehensive record of the testimony to ensure that any future contradictions can be identified as perjury. This meticulous approach to the interrogation reflects the high stakes of the matter, where every word spoken under oath carries the weight of potential criminal liability. The drama of the hearing lies not in emotional outbursts, but in the slow, methodical accumulation of evidence that points toward a profound institutional failure. The narrative continues to unfold as a complex study of power, responsibility, and the difficulty of maintaining integrity in the face of public scrutiny. The interrogation moves into its third act, descending into the granular details of the administrative negligence that allowed the Department of Justice email to bypass standard security filters. Representative Mrvan directs the committee's attention to the specific metadata of the communications, questioning how a directive of such immense operational consequence could be issued without the digital signature of the Bureau's Chief Information Officer. This focus on the technical mechanics of the breach serves to highlight a critical breakdown in the checks and balances internal to the FBI's communication hierarchy. The director's responses remain measured, yet they increasingly rely on the defense of plausible deniability, a tactic that Mrvan counters by presenting evidence of the director's presence at briefings where these very protocols were discussed. This creates a narrative of a leadership that is either dangerously disconnected from its core security functions or is actively participating in a culture of shadow governance. The dialogue turns toward the specific nature of the unsecured channels mentioned in the DOJ directive, which Mrvan reveals to be commercial, non-encrypted messaging platforms and private email servers. He posits that the use of such platforms by agents in the field is not merely a breach of protocol but a fundamental violation of the federal statutes governing the handling of classified intelligence. The representative forces a discussion on the vulnerability of these commercial platforms to foreign intelligence services, particularly those with sophisticated signal interception capabilities. By laying out the technical ease with which an adversary could harvest data from these channels, the hearing transforms from a policy debate into a lesson on the realities of modern digital espionage. The director's admission that he was unaware of the specific platforms being utilized serves as a damning indictment of his oversight of the agency's digital footprint. As the hours pass, the inquiry explores the potential for internal actors to have exploited this relaxed security environment for their own gain or to facilitate the leak of sensitive information. Mrvan questions whether the DOJ email was an intentional effort to create a leak-friendly environment, thereby allowing certain factions within the government to bypass the rigorous auditing associated with secure government servers. This line of questioning touches on the deep-seated fears of a state within a state, where official policy is manipulated to serve unspoken political or personal agendas. The director is placed in the unenviable position of having to defend the integrity of his subordinates, while simultaneously admitting that the agency failed to monitor their communications effectively. This part of the testimony highlights the inherent difficulty in maintaining internal security when the rules themselves are being rewritten by the leadership. The focus then shifts to the victims of this security failure, specifically the undercover assets whose safety may have been compromised by the transmission of operational data over open lines. Mrvan demands to know if any source or method has been officially burned or compromised as a direct result of the email's directives, a question that the director repeatedly declines to answer in a public session. This refusal creates a vacuum of accountability, leaving the committee and the public to speculate on the potential loss of life or intelligence capability. The representative uses this silence to emphasize the gravity of the director's earlier admission that he does not know the current status of the breached data. It suggests a scenario where the FBI is flying blind, unable to assess the damage to its own network of informants and clandestine operations. The narrative further examines the legal ramifications of the director's testimony, particularly concerning the concept of willful blindness in the context of government accountability. Mrvan argues that even if the director did not personally authorize the DOJ email, his failure to investigate the breach once it became known constitutes a separate and equally serious dereliction of duty. This legalistic approach to the interrogation aims to establish a basis for further disciplinary or legal action, moving the hearing beyond mere oversight into the realm of potential prosecution. The director's defense, which hinges on the sheer volume of communications he must oversee, is characterized by the representative as an admission of professional incompetence. This segment of the transcript captures the slow, methodical tightening of the analytical noose around the agency's leadership. Continuing the exploration of motive, the inquiry looks into whether the move to unsecured channels was a response to the clutter of secure systems, which often require multiple layers of authentication and slow down the speed of communication. Mrvan challenges the idea that convenience should ever be prioritized over security in the context of national intelligence, calling it a lazy man's approach to counterintelligence. The directors attempt to frame the decision as a pragmatic solution to a fast-moving operational environment is met with a sharp rebuke regarding the permanent nature of digital compromises. This exchange highlights the clash between the bureaucratic desire for efficiency and the absolute necessity of maintaining the sanctity of the secret. The hearing portrays a department that has lost its way, trading long-term security for short-term administrative ease. The questioning also delves into the relationship between the FBI and the Department of Justice, specifically how much autonomy the director has to push back against directives that he knows to be unsafe. Mrvan asks if the director ever raised concerns about the DOJ email with the Attorney General, or if he simply accepted the order as a matter of political expediency. This line of inquiry explores the limits of professional integrity in the face of superior political authority, painting a picture of a director who may have been more concerned with his standing in the administration than with the security of his agency. The director's vague answers regarding his private conversations with the Attorney General only serve to deepen the sense of a coordinated effort to shield the executive branch from transparency. The hearing becomes a study in the erosion of the independence of law enforcement. As this portion of the transcript nears its conclusion, the focus returns to the director's lack of knowledge regarding the compromised data's location, treating it as a central metaphor for the agency's loss of control. Mrvan suggests that if the FBI cannot track its own data, it cannot reasonably be expected to track the activities of foreign adversaries on American soil. This broader critique of the agency's capability is a significant escalation in the rhetoric of the hearing, moving from a specific breach to a general loss of confidence in the Bureau's mission. The director's increasingly defensive tone reflects the realization that the hearing is not just about a single email, but about his fitness to lead. The atmosphere in the room remains one of somber reflection on the state of the nation's premier security institution. The final questions of this segment address the protocols for damage assessment that should have been triggered the moment the breach was identified. Mrvan points out that according to the Bureau's own manual, a full-scale forensic audit should have been initiated immediately, yet there is no record of such an audit occurring. The director's inability to explain this lapse in procedure suggests a systemic failure to follow even the most basic internal regulations. This reinforces the narrative of an agency that considers itself above its own rules, a theme that resonates deeply with the committee's mandate for oversight. The hearing leaves the impression of a department in crisis, struggling to maintain a facade of order while the internal structures of accountability are in a state of collapse. The narrative of Part 3 concludes with a focus on the public's right to know the extent of the damage, balanced against the agency's claim that transparency would further jeopardize national security. Mrvan argues that the primary threat to security is not the public's awareness of the breach, but the breach itself and the lack of a plan to rectify it. This philosophical divide between the legislator and the intelligence official underscores the entire proceeding, highlighting the fundamental tension of a democracy attempting to govern a secret police force. The testimony recorded here serves as a historical marker for a moment of profound institutional vulnerability. The stage is now set for the final sections of the hearing, where the ultimate consequences of these failures will be weighed. The hearing enters a grueling fourth phase as Representative Mrvan pivots from the technicalities of the breach to the direct contradictions in the director's sworn testimony. This segment focuses on the specific moment when the digital paper trail definitively collided with the director's prior assertions of ignorance regarding the Department of Justice email. Mrvan introduces a series of internal logs that place the director in high-level briefings where the expedited transmission protocols, the euphemism used for unsecured channels, were the primary agenda item. The director's initial defense, which relied on the vastness of the Bureau's bureaucracy to explain his lack of awareness, begins to crumble under the weight of these specific, time-stamped records. Each document presented by the representative acts as a legal anchor, mooring the director to the very decisions he previously claimed were made far below his pay grade. The air in the committee room grows heavy with the implication that the director's earlier statements were not merely mistaken, but were a calculated attempt to mislead the legislative body. Mrvan's strategy shifts to an exploration of official versus actual policy, where he posits that the FBI has developed a secondary, unwritten code of conduct that prioritizes political results over statutory compliance. He questions whether the DOJ email was an outlier or simply the first time this clandestine operational style was caught in the light of day. The director, now visibly more cautious, attempts to frame the briefings as general discussions on operational agility rather than specific directives to violate security law. This semantic dance is met with a blunt rebuttal from Mrvan, who reads aloud the specific warnings issued by the FBI's own cybersecurity division months prior to the breach. These warnings, which explicitly predicted the vulnerabilities now being discussed, were apparently ignored or suppressed by the director's inner circle. This revelation paints a picture of a leadership that is not just negligent, but actively hostile to the internal safeguards designed to protect the agency's integrity. The inquiry then delves into the specific contents of the compromised data, specifically focusing on its value to foreign intelligence services. Mrvan asks the director to confirm if the information transmitted through unsecured channels included target packages for ongoing counter-espionage operations. The director's hesitation and eventual pivot to a closed-door session request only fuels the representative's argument that the breach was catastrophic in scope. Mrvan argues that the public deserves to know the level of risk their own government has placed them in, regardless of the agency's desire to save face. This portion of the hearing highlights the tension between the need to know of the Oversight Committee and the need to hide, often inherent in executive agencies facing scandal. The narrative emphasizes that the director's inability to account for the location of this data suggests that it is already in the hands of entities that wish the United States harm. The dialogue moves into the realm of administrative retaliation, as Mrvan investigates reports that agents who questioned the legality of the DOJ email were subjected to internal investigations. This weaponization of the Bureau's disciplinary arm against its own whistleblowers becomes a central theme of the segment, illustrating a culture of fear that starts at the top. Mrvan produces a memo from the director's office that outlines a zero-tolerance policy for those who deviate from the new transmission protocols, effectively forcing agents to choose between their security clearances and their professional ethics. The director's defense of these measures as necessary for departmental unity is characterized by the representative as the hallmark of an authoritarian leadership style. This exchange serves as a chilling critique of how institutional power can be used to silence dissent and bypass the law from within. As the afternoon progresses, the representative focuses on the financial cost of the breach, including the millions of dollars required to scrub the compromised systems and relocate assets. He questions how the director can justify requesting an increased budget for cybersecurity when the agency's current leadership has shown such a flagrant disregard for basic digital hygiene. This line of questioning hits the agency where it is most vulnerable: its funding and its relationship with the taxpayers. The director is forced to provide a justification for why he should remain the steward of these massive public resources given the evidence of systemic mismanagement presented throughout the day. The hearing portrays a deep-seated institutional rot, where the very mechanisms of law enforcement have been turned into tools of self-preservation for a political elite. The focus then shifts back to the specific email, with Mrvan demanding a line-by-line explanation of the director's eventual admission of ignorance. He asks how the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States can admit to a failure of situational awareness regarding a breach that could potentially disable a decade's worth of intelligence gathering. The director's response, which attempts to lean on the complexity of modern threats, is dismantled by the representative as a generic talking point that ignores the specific failures of his office. Mrvan's persistence in seeking a direct answer highlights the director's increasing isolation, as even his usual allies on the committee remain silent in the face of the evidence. The narrative captures a moment of total institutional exposure, where the director is left without the shield of bureaucratic complexity to hide behind. The inquiry explores the potential for foreign bribery or influence to have played a role in the creation of these unsecured channels. While Mrvan remains neutral, his questions about the director's private meetings with representatives of companies that provide these unsecured platforms raise significant ethical concerns. The suggestion that the security of the nation was traded for corporate interests or political favors adds a new, more sinister layer to the investigation. The director's denial of these allegations is firm, yet the representative's ability to draw connections between policy changes and private sector influence suggests a broader systemic vulnerability. This segment of the transcript acts as a warning about the intersection of private technology and public security, and the lack of oversight that exists in that space. As Part 4 nears its conclusion, the director's credibility is analyzed through the lens of his past interactions with the committee. Mrvan reminds the room of several previous occasions where the director made assurances that later proved to be false, establishing a pattern of strategic misinformation. This contextualizes the current breach not as an isolated incident, but as the inevitable outcome of a leadership built on a foundation of opacity. The representative's final questions for this segment focus on the specific legal definitions of perjury and obstruction of justice, signaling a move toward a more formal investigative outcome. The director's reactions, recorded in the transcript as long pauses and consultations with his legal counsel, underscore the peril he now finds himself in. The narrative of this portion ends with a focus on the structural integrity of the Department of Justice itself, questioning whether the agency can still function as an impartial arbiter of the law. Mrvan posits that if the FBI's leadership is allowed to bypass security protocols and mislead Congress without consequence, the rule of law is essentially dead. This philosophical escalation shifts the hearing from a specific investigation into a broader defense of the American democratic system. The director's final words in this segment are defensive, asserting his loyalty to the mission, yet the evidence presented by the representative suggests a definition of the mission that is at odds with the public interest. The hearing remains a stark portrayal of a high-stakes struggle for the soul of a federal institution. The transition to the final phase of the testimony is marked by a palpable sense of exhaustion and resignation from the director's side of the table. The representative, however, remains energized by the consistency of the evidence he has laid out, preparing to move into the final set of questions regarding the path forward. This part of the transcript documents the slow, inevitable collapse of a prepared narrative under the weight of factual scrutiny. It serves as a testament to the power of legislative oversight when applied with rigor and a refusal to accept bureaucratic excuses. The stage is now perfectly set for the concluding arguments and the final assessment of the director's accountability. The final phase of the congressional inquiry reaches a fever pitch as Representative Mrvan moves for the ultimate clarification on the director's state of mind during the height of the security crisis. This concluding segment focuses on the stark admission that Director Patel was effectively in the dark regarding the final destination of the sensitive data. Mrvan presents a final exhibit, an internal memo from the Bureau's Technical Security Branch which explicitly stated that once the data left the secure government environment, it was essentially unrecoverable and unmonitored. The representative uses this to drive home the point that the director's previous claims of a controlled environment were a total fabrication. This moment represents the final breach of the director's defensive perimeter, forcing a confrontation with the reality of a leaderless agency. The atmosphere in the room is one of somber finality, as the weight of the institutional failure becomes an undeniable fact of the record. The dialogue turns to the specific legal consequences of the director's inability to track the data, focusing on the potential for criminal negligence. Mrvan asks if the director is prepared to take personal responsibility for the lives of field assets that may now be permanently endangered by his lack of oversight. The director's response is a masterclass in bureaucratic deflection, yet it fails to satisfy the committee's demand for a human accounting of the cost. The representative highlights that "I don't know" is not an acceptable answer for the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country when the question concerns the security of national intelligence. This exchange serves as the narrative's climax, exposing the hollow core of a leadership that prioritized administrative convenience over the lives of its agents. The hearing transitions from an investigation into a public indictment of a failed philosophy of governance. As the questioning winds down, the focus shifts to the broader implications of this fictionalized drama for the future of American institutional transparency. Mrvan posits that the director's behavior has set a dangerous precedent, where high-ranking officials can simply claim ignorance to avoid the consequences of their policy decisions. He argues that if the head of the FBI is not informed about the most basic security protocols of his agency, He is either fundamentally incompetent or is being shielded by a Praetorian guard of subordinates. This line of inquiry explores the systemic rot that occurs when accountability is treated as a political inconvenience rather than a constitutional requirement. The director's final, weary defense is that the agency must move forward, but Mrvan counters that moving forward is impossible without an honest reckoning with the past. The narrative concludes that the damage to the Bureau's credibility may take generations to repair, if it can be repaired at all. The inquiry looks at the potential for a complete overhaul of the Department of Justice's communication infrastructure in the wake of this disaster. Mrvan suggests that the current leadership has proven itself incapable of managing the transition to a modern digital landscape while maintaining the necessary secrecy. He calls for an independent audit not just of the data, but of the culture that allowed the DOJ email to be treated as a valid directive in the first place. The director is forced to listen as the representative outlines a vision for a bureau that is subject to far more stringent legislative oversight and technical auditing. This vision serves as a critique of the current state of affairs, where the secret nature of the work is often used as a blanket to cover up administrative failures. The hearing ends with a sense that the era of blind trust in the intelligence community has officially come to an end. The final minutes of the transcript record a series of closing statements that summarize the catastrophic failure of accountability that has been laid bare. Mrvan concludes that the director was either a willing participant in a scheme to mislead Congress or a bystander to his own agency's descent into chaos. Neither option, the representative notes, allows for the director to continue in his current role with the confidence of the American people. The director's final statement is brief, an attempt to maintain a shred of professional dignity while the evidence of his failures remains on the screens behind him. The narrative of the hearing thus serves as a powerful critique of the fragility of democratic institutions when their leaders forget who they serve. It portrays a system at its breaking point, where the truth is the only thing that can prevent a total collapse of public trust. The legacy of the hearing is framed as a turning point in the relationship between the executive and legislative branches regarding the management of classified information. Mrvan's systematic dismantling of the director's testimony is presented as a necessary act of institutional hygiene, intended to flush out the rot before it spreads further. The critique focuses on the idea that in a modern democracy, no one is above the law, and no department is too sensitive to be held to the standards of basic competence. The director's admission of ignorance regarding the status of the breached data remains the defining moment of the entire proceeding, a symbol of a leadership that lost its way in the digital age. This part of the transcript serves as a warning to future leaders that the digital paper trail is permanent, and that "I don't know" will never be enough to escape the judgment of history. As the gavel falls, the narrative reflects on the fictional nature of the drama as a way to engage the public in a serious discussion about the limits of government power. It suggests that while the specific characters and emails may be part of a structured narrative, the themes of accountability and transparency are very much real. The hearing is a mirror held up to the face of modern law enforcement, showing the cracks in the facade of total control. Mrvan is depicted not as a hero, but as a functioning part of a system that is designed to catch its own failures before they become fatal. The director is depicted not as a villain, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when the weight of office is not supported by a foundation of integrity. This concludes the transcript of the hearing, leaving the final judgment to the public record. The narrative ends with a reflection on the status of the missing data, which remains a phantom presence throughout the final moments of the testimony. If the director does not know where it is, the implication is that it is everywhere and nowhere, a permanent vulnerability in the nation's armor. Mrvan's final look toward the director is one of profound disappointment, representing a loss of faith in a once venerated institution. The silence that fills the room after the adjournment is more telling than any of the thousands of words spoken during the day. It is the silence of an institution that has finally run out of excuses and must now face the long, difficult road of rebuilding its honor. The hearing is over, but the consequences of the testimony have only just begun to ripple through the halls of power. This meticulously reconstructed account serves as a masterclass in the art of congressional oversight and the perils of institutional opacity. It highlights the role of the persistent questioner in stripping away the layers of bureaucratic defense to find the uncomfortable truth at the center of a crisis. The story of Mrvan and Patel is a story for our times, exploring the tension between the speed of the digital world and the slow, deliberate pace of the law. It reminds the reader that the price of freedom is the constant, often uncomfortable, demand for transparency from those we entrust with our safety. The final assessment is that while the data may be lost, the truth has finally been found, even if it arrived through a path of dramatic confrontation and institutional failure.